Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of FitRx. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Dennis, and my guest today is Robert Sikes, who is an author of a book about a ketogenic bodybuilding. He is also a podcaster himself called Keto Savage, the Keto Savage Podcast. And so we're just going to visit with him today about you've heard me talk before about, lower carb, kind of a ketogenic lifestyle just for the general public. But, as we start getting into bodybuilding and shows, it's just, kind of a whole different story. And especially myself being around a little bit in the bodybuilding community, I know, I don't see too many people using a ketogenic type of a diet for competition and, for building muscle and stuff like that. So just kind of anxious to pick his brain about that. And even if you're not interested in, bodybuilding per se, I think you're going to learn some stuff, just get some tips about just how to, burn body fat, get leaner, that kind of thing. So anxious to see what he has to say. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hey man, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So, if you will, just, first, before we go there, anything else you want to throw out there in the introduction that I didn't mention?
No, man, that's about it. So yeah, I've been natural bodybuilding since I was a junior in high school, and I've been ketogenic bodybuilding about half of that time. So half of my bodybuilding career has been ketogenic, and that's pretty much been the basis for my lifestyle now. My wife and I both do it. We just had a kiddo, and pregnancy was all keto, so our entire livelihood is all ketogenic.
Wow. Good for you. Well, tell us just kind of how you got started in bodybuilding, number one, and then two, how you discovered going just completely ketogenic and maybe why you wanted to do that, because that's, as I mentioned, that's certainly not all that prevalent in the bodybuilding circles to do strict keto, especially as it pertains to competition bodybuilding.
Totally. So when I first started in high school, I was, like I said, a junior in high school. I was 115 pounds when I started training. So I was the small guy in the class. I didn't have any size to me at all. My uncle was probably the one in my family that kind of pushed me to start weight training. He was into football, and he was just the more outgoing member of the family. I kind of wanted to emulate that persona. So started working out. He taught me how to do a bicep curl, and the rest is history, man. I just got addicted. I started watching all kinds of YouTube videos of all the bodybuilders in like the 90s. And then just trying to emulate them. My first year and a half of working out, I didn't have access to a gym membership. So I fashioned a bunch of my own homemade gym equipment with pieces of steel I had laying around my dad's shop. And that's pretty much what I used for training for the first year and a half or so. I was following a traditional carbohydrate-based diet, 6-7 meals a day, eating every 2 or 3 hours, lots of carbs, lots of protein, pretty minimal dietary fat. And I saw success with that in the sense that I was able to build muscle, get lean. My first show, I was able to, won my first show, but it was all with a carbohydrate-based approach. However, after that first show, I started developing a bunch of disordered eating tendencies. I'd binge and I'd purge, and it just kind of really slippery slope for me after, gaining so much weight to put on some size and losing so much weight. And then after that show was over, gaining it all back very quickly. So it just was a very downward spiral from a psychological relationship with food standpoint. So I needed to find something that was more sustainable for me in that regard. And lo and behold, fell upon the ketogenic diet kind of by accident. I was following a protocol called carbohydrate backloading developed by John Kiefer. And that's basically ketogenic during the day and then a bunch of high glycemic index carbs at night. And that was working fairly well. But at some point I felt guilty eating a tray full of brownies smothered in syrup right before going to bed. So then I just phased out the carbs and was doing carbohydrate backloading minus the carbs, which is pretty much keto. And my training took off and improved even more. And my relationship with food improved. So I was pretty much sold on the diet at that point. And then once I realized what it was I was doing, I started to dive deeper into the research, learned about the ketogenic diet been used in the 1920s for epileptic children. And then I just dove deeper and deeper. And now I've been doing it ever since now for about 7 years, strict keto, I believe.
So, wow. And that's a long time to be fairly strict keto. Do you, we'll get into that. So, when I think of bodybuilders, typically they have a bulking season, and then of course you lean up for a show. And I can see, so I hadn't talked about this a lot on my podcast, but a lot of my listeners know I did a physique competition this time last year. And so that was kind of a bucket list thing for me. And it was my first glimpse at, kind of what bodybuilders go through a little bit. And I was kind of lower carb there towards the end. And afterwards, of course, I kind of splurged on carbs and didn't feel good. So, when a bodybuilder is doing that kind of thing a lot, I can see where that would really mess you up, kind of doing that yo-yo. But I guess back to my original question, a lot of bodybuilders will say that, to bulk up. So when you're in the bulking season, that you need carbs and you need that insulin surge. And so how did you get around that? Did you just find that to be just kind of false advice, or kind of talk about that?
Yeah. So when I first got into it, I was, I didn't have a mentor or a coach per se. So I was just getting all my bodybuilding wisdom through Flex magazines and Muscular Development magazines that I was getting at the grocery store, checkout counter. And they would all say, you got to eat big to get big, got to eat your carbs, eat all this calories. So when I was bulking up for that first show, I bulked up to 230 pounds. I went from 115 to 230 pounds, and I'm only 6'7", 6'8", or 5'7", 5'8", pardon. So, 230 pounds on my frame was not a good look. But I was delusional. I thought that I was going to be able to, drop 20, 30 pounds and then compete at a shredded, 200 pounds. But that just wasn't the reality. For me to get into the conditioning that I needed to be competitive, I wound up losing 80 pounds in 12 weeks for that first show and competed at 150. And for me to, bulk up to 230 and then drop 80 pounds in 12 weeks, compete, get really lean, and then splurge on all the carbs in sight afterwards. And then I think after that first show, I gained 20 pounds in 24 hours after that first show. So it's a very, very much so a very yo-yo style approach to nutrition. And then with that, all the binging and purging, so it just wasn't good. Now, I typically stay within about 20 pounds of stage weight. So I'm in an off season right now, and I'm at about 180, 185 pounds, and I compete at about 160, 163 at the moment. So I'm within about 20 pounds of, striking weight. And for me, that's a much cleaner off season. I don't have to have these crazy swings in the building and cutting phases. It is definitely advantageous to have a legitimate building phase where you are in a caloric surplus, and you're able to prime your body for building more lean muscle tissue and having growth. And some body fat is going to accompany that growth. But you don't have to be in these crazy bulks and, just tremendous cuts in which you're going from one extreme to the other, which is very taxing on the body. As far as having to have insulin to build muscle, that's not really the case. As long as you're in a caloric surplus and you're activating muscle protein synthesis and you're training with progressive overload principles, you're going to be able to build lean tissue just fine.
Okay. So you didn't necessarily feel like you needed the carbs to build muscle, as long as you've got a caloric excess and obviously you're getting your protein and all that stuff, and you feel like you can build muscle just fine doing that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been, like I said, keto now for 7 years, and I've done, I think I've gone through 2 or 3 competitive cycles in that span. And every single time I lean down, I look noticeably better. And it's just a significant improvement from the last competitive season. So definitely improved with each season, while, totally avoiding carbohydrates.
And so do you, and not that this really matters, but I'm curious, like, especially if you're in a bulking phase, and obviously you're really increasing your protein intake, I would think, and kind of traditional keto is predominantly fat, a little bit of protein, and very low carbs. I'm guessing you're probably doing a lot more protein with that, excess in protein. Are you staying in ketosis?
Yeah, good question. So my protein is definitely higher. Like right now it's kind of weird because I'm doing a 4,000 calorie experiment. So I'm eating 4,000 calories consecutively for the next 3 weeks to see kind of how that affects my biomarkers. But generally speaking, while in a building phase, I'm consuming about 225 grams of protein, which is more than enough for my build. However, I'm consuming enough calories at that intake to still elicit about a 70 to 75% of my calories coming from dietary fat. So it's still very ketogenic from a macro ratio distribution standpoint. I'm just consuming enough calories in that surplus to also be consuming a pretty significant degree of protein.
So you're you're pretty much in ketosis then, you think, most of the time?
Yeah. I'm not an advocate for like checking blood glucose and ketones, all the time if you're not really needing to, but I check mine just out of curiosity. And, I checked mine the other day and I was registering, I think 1.5 or 2 millimolar on the ketones.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. So why do you think it is that the kind of conventional bodybuilding community doesn't do more of this?
I think it's becoming more popular within the natural space. I don't think you'll ever become mainstream within like the IFBB leagues, because a lot of those guys, I mean, they're taking all kinds of performance enhancing drugs anyways. One of which is they are injecting insulin. So if you're trying to optimize performance from a ketogenic standpoint, but then you're injecting insulin, it's probably going to defeat the purpose there. But within natural bodybuilding circles, I've seen it kind of, take more precedence, especially as people are just trying to have a better psychological relationship with food and then I have to go through the crazy swings. I mean, one of the beauties of kind of my protocol with the competition prep is that I don't have to do any dehydration. I don't have to take any diuretics prior to the show. My peak week protocol is pretty simple. I mean, it's honestly a slight increase in sodium the day before the show, but I'm constantly staying hydrated. I'm not cutting water at any point. And then rather than having a carb up refeed meal, I simply have a ketogenic caloric refeed meal. So an increase of about 30 to 40 calories the day before the show, but all coming from, protein and dietary fat. So there's not really any, crazy manipulations that are taking place in peak week. So it's a little bit more sustainable, a little bit less extreme. And for people that are, benefiting from a ketogenic diet and lifestyle, you're not having to introduce these carbs, which many of them don't respond well to anyways, in order to still look amazing on show day.
So, you've been strict for a while, it sounds like. I mean, do you ever just feel like you're missing out? I mean, of just not eating, I don't know, birthday cake and ice cream and, a lot of the typical foods that people eat.
No, man, it's interesting because like when I was really struggling with my food tendencies, like it was debilitating. Like I would just obsess over food. I would literally eat everything in sight and feel guilty for it. And then I'd, punish myself for days on end. And just that was a very debilitating, dark time in my life. So once I found keto and I was able to break free from that, like that was it for me. Like I didn't need to find something else. I didn't feel like I was missing out. And now that I've been doing it for as long as I have, and it's kind of almost become my identity within the space, so to speak. I just feel great, man. Like I feel like I'm not missing out on anything. And there's so many keto substitutes for all the carbohydrate based foods. I mean, like when I got married, we had keto cheesecake. My wife made keto cheesecake. Like when I have a show and I compete and I win the show, like we go out to an all you can eat Brazilian steakhouse. And then I have like a homemade keto brownie afterwards or something. So there's not really anything that I feel like I'm missing out on. There's like a substitute for anything. And honestly, like the way I feel and perform with a strict ketogenic diet far outweighs the temporary high that I would get from a massive bolus of sugar. And it just doesn't make it worth my while.
Interesting. So I was reading a book last night. I read a lot of books just with me doing the podcast about just, nutrition and, diet, exercise, whatever. And this particular author was talking about, I think it was a dietitian, and talking about that one of the things about keto is it's not sustainable. And I mean, you're kind of proof that it is with you, doing it for, you said 7 years. And so, I mean, what would you say to people that say, well, keto is not sustainable?
I think, I don't know, man, it's interesting. Like I've been in the nutrition space for quite some time. I've seen all these hypes come and go. I've seen these fads come and go, and certain people will definitely view the ketogenic diet as a fad. But the typical clientele that I'm working with, the typical people that I'm talking with on a day-to-day basis have come to this diet and lifestyle as a way to break free of what they were doing, which was not working. And they found so much success with this ketogenic approach that they have no reason to deviate from it for the rest of their life. They're just incredibly passionate about it. And I know so many people like that. I'm like that. My wife's like that. And so many people that I am very close relationships with are like that. So for the people that think it's not sustainable, they just simply haven't met many people that have found it to be incredibly sustainable. And when they argue that it's not sustainable, it's mostly from an argument of, people are going to feel like they're missing out. And I don't understand it from a biological standpoint, because from a carbohydrate, there are no essential carbohydrates. Like your body's performance is not going to be, hindered in the absence of dietary carbohydrates. Your body's able to produce whatever necessary carbohydrates from brain glucose is through gluconeogenesis. So there's no essential carbohydrates that have to be consumed by the body in order to function at an elite level. So from a biological standpoint, it doesn't make sense. And from a psychological standpoint, if you're one that prefers to be in the absence of carbohydrates anyways, then, it's clearly sustainable in that regard as well.
So back to the kind of the competition, because I'm just interested in this personally. It sounds like, so pretty much all you're doing when you are prepping for a show is you start cutting the calories. I mean, you're still probably getting higher protein, higher fat type foods. You're still low carb, and then you start cutting the calories, and then give us an idea of kind of the difference in peak week as I went through, and I kind of dehydrated myself, and it was really a miserable time. I kind of an old school person helping me, which was fine. I mean, I did well, but walk us through that again as you begin to prepare for a show, maybe like a month out, what that looks like for you.
Yeah. So my prep protocol is basically broken down into 7 phases. This is kind of what I wrote about in the book as well. But like phase 1 is simply establishing what your, initial stats are, what your maintenance caloric intake is, what your body fat percentage is, figuring out how much weight you have to lose in order to be competitive on show day. That's basically what phase 1 primarily consists of. Phase 2 is I'll start people at a fairly high fat ratio. So I'll start people at about their maintenance intake with about 80% of their calories coming from dietary fat. So a very high very high fat intake, relatively low or moderate protein at that higher caloric intake, their maintenance intake. And then from there, I'll start simultaneously dropping their dietary fat while increasing their dietary protein until I figure out what their unique protein threshold is. Once that threshold has been reached, then I'll start dropping both fat and protein. So calories are continuing to drop. And that is phase 3. And then phase 4, which is probably about a month out from the show, I'll start introducing these ketogenic caloric refeeds. And we'll start with about a 30% increase in total average daily calories for that Friday. If the show is on a Saturday, we'll start with that refeed falling on a Friday. And then we'll increase sodium incrementally, increase the caloric intake on that refeed day while continuing to drop daily calories on the other days to figure out what amount of sodium and what caloric range works best for them and what macro distribution works best for them for that proper peak. And then the next phase 5, is the actual peak week itself. So the training manipulations that take place during peak week, scaling back on the intensity, getting everything dialed in that regard, allowing your body to flush out any inflammation and excess fluid weight, but then forcing any of the water that is in your body into your muscle tissue and not in your subcutaneous layer of skin, so that you look more vascular and dialed in on show day. And then phase 6 and 7 are basically transitioning into a reverse diet phase where we increase calories, increase fat and dietary protein to kind of return to some degree of normalcy and reach their new maintenance intake.
And I think you mentioned this before, but you don't really manipulate the salt or your water intake prior to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I'll increase sodium, very gradually on the refeed day itself. So, for instance, for me as an example, my average daily sodium intake is around 6,000 milligrams, 6 grams. And then on the refeed day, which is a Friday, I may bump that up to 8 grams or 7 grams. So, an increase in sodium to basically just force any of the fluid that is in my subcutaneous layer of skin into the actual muscle tissue to help volumize the muscle tissue, bring a fuller look and a thinner skin, appearance on show day itself.
And I'm assuming that gives you the vascularization that you're wanting and all that.
Yeah, it helps with blood pressure. I mean, you're able to have a little bit of an increase in blood pressure, so you get a better pump. And then the skin will be thinner because you have less subcutaneous fluids in there. So it's going to showcase more of that vascularity and, bring out the definition that much more. Of course, all of that to say, if you're not really lean at that point, those manipulations don't do anything anyways. So, I mean, you really got to be, incredibly dialed in and shredded at that point for those little tweaks and adjustments to really, showcase themselves.
So what is a typical body fat percentage for you, like off season now, and then maybe on stage?
Right now I'm sitting at about 15% probably. I did an in-body scan the other day, and I think it had me at like 15-16%. And then when I get, down for a show, I've been as low as 3.2% via the in-body. So pretty lean. And that's in body. So it's a little bit of disparity there, but I've done the caliper test too. And I've done the DEXA scans, and, depending on which device you're testing with, I'm probably somewhere between 3 and 5 for sure.
And you got that low by just, lowering the calories. I mean, pretty much staying keto, but just, adjusting your calories.
Yeah. I mean, it goes beyond, calories obviously are changing the whole time, but it really focusing on the macronutrient distribution. I mean, you can drop your calories, with any type of dietary protocol, and you'll lose weight if everything else is, equated for and dialed in. But the beauty of, I think, the ketogenic approach, especially in those latter phases of a prep, is that as calories get that low, your dietary fat is still relatively high. So by having that higher dietary fat, I've got cholesterol coming in. So my, cholesterol is a precursor to testosterone. So my hormonal levels never really have near the dip that they were prior to me doing a ketogenic prep. So I'm able to have higher circulating testosterone and just keep things in much more of a, healthy range while at that caloric deficit, which is obviously going to have a positive effect on my ability to continue to train hard, recover better from my workouts. And then the more I'm able to do that, the better I'm able to retain that lean muscle tissue. So I'm able to retain that lean mass, but also lose body fat at a more efficient rate.
And how many calories are you getting, say, I don't know, a couple of weeks before a show, 2, 3, 4 weeks before a show?
Usually I'm around 1,700 or so at that point in the prep. And then my maintenance intake is probably around 3,200. So, I'll start right there around that maintenance intake, 32, 33, 3,400 calories. And then I'll whittle that down to 1,700 calories by the end of it all.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really lean. I wasn't near that low when I did it. Of course, I really needed a little bit more time. It's the first time I'd ever done it. And I needed probably another 1 to 2 weeks. One of the things I learned from it, but I wasn't near that lean. I should have checked. I didn't. I'm guessing I was probably about 7%. So I needed a couple more weeks, but yeah, that's really lean if you got down that low.
Well, a lot of people don't give themselves enough time. Like when I did my first show, I only gave myself 12 weeks. And losing 80 pounds in 12 weeks is just no part of that's healthy. I wouldn't recommend it for my worst enemy. But whereas now, I've only got about 20 pounds to lose, but I'll still give myself about 5 months to do it. So I diet down incredibly slowly, which makes retaining that lean muscle tissue that much easier.
Mm-hmm. So walk us through, I know you said you're kind of in the off season now, but walk us through what a typical day looks like for you. I'm starting to ask this question more and more of my guests. But walk us through just maybe what your nutrition looks like on a day-to-day, what your workout routine looks like for you.
Yeah. So I'm waking up, well, that's kind of all skewed right now because we have a newborn, but generally I'm waking up between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, do email work, I do client work, I just kind of do a lot of computer work. Then I have a cup of coffee with some heavy cream. Normally have 2 cups of coffee with heavy cream, sit on the front porch with my wife, watch the sun come up, help my circadian rhythm, just kind of plan out the day. Then I come to work. I've got our compound here, as we call it. I've got employees. We have a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. So we kind of get a plan for the day and start attacking that plan. Mostly I've got podcasts throughout the day. They do all the production with our business. I'm doing a lot of the, strategic aspect of the business, podcasting, communication, brand building, things of that nature. And then I'll typically have 2 meals a day. First one being around noon or 1 o'clock. And that's normally something like ground beef and eggs, liverwurst sausage, maybe kielbasa sausage, maybe a steak, casserole, something of that nature. And then my final meal is normally like a ribeye steak with some butter or something like that. And then I eat a keto brick at some point throughout the day as well. I might cut that in half and have half for the first meal, half for the second meal. And that's pretty much how I structure my meal timing and frequency. And then depending on what day it is, I'll either train in the morning, and then my first meal around noon will be that, meal that breaks that fast after I train, or I'll eat that meal around 1, and then I'll train with my crew after they get off work at around 4.
So even like now when you're bulking, you're still fasting every morning and still training in the fasted state?
Yeah, I prefer training fasted for sure. For me, I get a better muscle pump if I'm not, if I've got a meal heavy on my system, then I'm liable to lose that meal with the intensity of the workout. So I prefer to just train fasted. But the 2 meals I have after that point are really calorically dense meals. So I'm still getting a lot of calories in just, with that 2 meal frequency.
Interesting. And then so when you start prepping for a show, is it going to look very similar, just maybe less calories at those 2 meals?
Yeah, very, very similar. I mean, when my calories get really low, like when I'm about a month and a half out and I'm sub 1900 calories, I typically transition to an OMAD style approach, or only one meal a day at that point.
Interesting.
And for me, I found that, it's totally counter to traditional eat every 2 or 3 hours.
It is, yes.
Up, all that stuff. So very opposite of that. But for me, eating one large meal and having true satiety from that sitting is much more enjoyable and sustainable than, having multiple smaller meals sprinkled throughout the day that always leave me wanting a little bit more. So I kind of just prefer the one meal. Plus my productivity is exponentially higher because rather than fixating on meals, all throughout the day, I just plan on my one meal, enjoy that one meal, and then get back to work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And especially since you got that lean, I mean, just doing, because again, like you said, all these traditional bodybuilders say you got to eat 6-7 meals a day, small meals to kick your metabolism. And so you're getting really lean eating one meal a day.
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I'm that low on the calories, I'm definitely just eating one meal a day. I mean, you can eat more, kind of it. I mean, some of it's personal preference, but I've definitely found more benefit in just having that one meal.
Interesting. And what about any kind of supplements that you do?
Honestly, man, I'm super, super simple with my supplementation. Like I'll have a creatine monohydrate when I remember to take it, vitamin D when I remember to take it. And that's really pretty much it. Like I don't really supplement hardly at all. I'll have a pre-workout on occasion. But honestly, I don't really supplement much with that. Caffeine, if my calories are really low, I'll sometimes add a caffeine pill or tablet. But mostly I've just been trying to wean off on the caffeine as well and just stick with the coffee.
Interesting. So you're not doing any kind of branched chain amino acids, I mean, anything like that?
No, I'll sometimes bring the branch chains in at the very end of a prep when my calories are low, just kind of as a way to, safeguard the fact that I am consuming less protein, less nutrients. But I'm not, I mean, when my calories are higher, especially like now that I'm in a building phase, I'm not taking any amino acids at all.
Interesting. I know for me, and it sounds like you're getting a lot of your protein from whole foods, which is always preferable, but for me, sometimes it's just hard. And so I'll make me a whey protein shake and put some different things in it and have it, maybe after my workout. Or do you do any of that kind of thing?
Not so much. I mean, the keto brick has a serving of whey protein in there, depending on what flavor. So like I'll have that at some point throughout the day. So I'm guessing I'm getting some whey protein in from that, but I'm not really a stickler about, having like I used to be like, if I didn't have my whey protein shake 20 minutes after I worked out, then all my gains were for naught, which is not really the case so much anymore. I mean, occasionally I have a protein shake if I'm, just shy on my calories. I need to get some food in, but I can't tell you the last time I honestly had a protein shake. It's been a long time.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. Well, very good. So you also host a podcast, and it's called Keto Savage. I mentioned that at the start. So tell us a little bit about that and just kind of what you talk about on the show.
Honestly, a little bit of everything, man. I mostly, I got into it talking about, fitness, nutrition, natural bodybuilding with the ketogenic diet. And that's definitely the bulk of the conversation, but I'll bring on a pretty broad array of guests, talk a lot about mindset. So I love entrepreneurship and business as well. So I'll bring on some business experts to pick their brain there. But just anybody that has an interesting story, anybody that has a story that I want to, pick apart and just learn more about.
Very good. Okay. And so let's see, your website is ketosavage.com, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that's how people can get a hold of you and work with you and all that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Yeah. And then let's see, the book that you wrote is just Ketogenic Bodybuilding. Yeah.
You can get that on Amazon. I made a separate website for that. It's ketogenicbodybuilding.com. Okay. And with the website, there's if anybody wants it, there's a free download spreadsheet that basically acts as a companion spreadsheet to the book where people can log their weight and their macros and things of that nature.
Very nice. Okay. Well, before we wrap up, anything you want to throw out there just kind of about, this that I did not ask you?
No, man. I mean, honestly, I think just anybody that has kind of been on the fence about following a ketogenic diet and just, jumping in and trying it, by all means, give it a shot. A lot of people do it. They don't give it enough time for their body to truly adapt. So if somebody's going to try a ketogenic approach, I encourage them to, give it an honest 4 weeks minimum, so their body has time to adapt and acclimate to using fat and ketones as the primary fuel source. But if you're going to do it, I fully encourage people to give it a shot.
Oh, one thing I was going to ask you specifically about your workout. Are you doing kind of a traditional bodybuilding, workout split? I mean, what does your actual workouts look like?
Yeah, I'm pretty old school with the bodybuilding split. I mean, I typically I'm changing it up a little bit right now because we're trying to figure out what our schedule's like with this new kiddo. But generally speaking, I'm doing like an 8-day block. So for every 8 days, I'm training 6 of those days, 2 off days. And each body part's getting targeted twice a week, once with more of a heavy focus, once with more of a hypertrophy focus. But by doing that, by being based off an 8-day cycle, it's not like leg days always on Monday or something like that. So I'm able to kind of flux through the week without it being just super consistent, which I find to be advantageous. So that's what I've been personally doing. So pretty much a body part split, but with a heavy hypertrophy focus there.
Okay. And then does that change as you get closer to a show? Do you start doing more higher reps or kind of lighter weight or anything?
No, the weight training pretty much stays consistent. The only manipulation I'll make with the training as I get closer to the show is just increased cardio. So I'll typically use the Stairmaster as my preferred form of cardio, and I'll keep those locked in at, not exceeding a 20-minute session, but I'll basically treat cardio as like a minimum viable dose. It kind of has an inverse relationship with calories. So as calories drop, cardio increases, and I'll start with, very minimal amount of cardio and then scale that up throughout the course of the prep. Either by increasing the time, the frequency, or the duration, or the intensity rather.
Okay. All right. Well, as we wrap up, I always ask my guests if they could give us one health tip that would make us healthier today. What would you say to that?
One health tip to make us healthier today. Really doubling down on sleep quality, I think, would be a really good one. I feel like sleep, we all know sleep is important. But the only time in my life where I've really doubled down on it was, when I wanted to pull out all the stops and perform, improve my performance with the weight training. And when I really doubled down on sleep quality and just pulled out all the stops, did all the biohacks to improve my sleep, really track my REM sleep, track my deep sleep, improve my breathing while sleeping, my sleep quality improved and my day-to-day performance improved. So I think really giving sleep quality the attention it deserves is a worthwhile use of your time for sure.
Yeah. Great advice. Can you share what some of those biohacks are that's worked for you?
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy because all this is totally gone out the window since having this infant. But before he was around, what I did was I turned the AC down to about 60 degrees, keep it pretty cold in the house. I do mouth taping. Have you ever heard of mouth taping?
I've done it. You bet. I've done it.
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in that. I do mouth taping with the micropore tape. I do blackout everything. Like I've got blackout curtains. I'll do the face mask if I need to. And then I'll even go as far as to have earplugs in if I'm like at a hotel or if I'm sleeping someplace that's noisier, but really going low on the temperature and doing the mouth tape are probably my 2 easy go-to options.
Very good. All right. I like it. All right. Well, appreciate you coming on. Appreciate all the info. Very interesting stuff. I encourage people to check out the book, check out his website, and appreciate everyone listening. And we will talk to you next time.